So 9th edition has largely been an edition of buffs. New codexes come out with ever-increasing powerful rules. Today though, we're going to talk about some units and armies that have received the short end of the stick and have been slapped with some of the biggest nerfs of the edition so far. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about some of the units and options that Games Workshop has already seen the need to take down a peg or two throughout the edition. We'll start out with a few honourable mentions, then go through what I'd say are some of the 5 biggest and most punishing changes. I'm sure this won't be a complete list by any stretch of the imagination, so if you have any relevant examples for your codex, please let us know below, and if there's anything that I really think that I should have included in the list, I'll include it in a pinned comment. So first up, let's talk through a few honourable mentions, things that maybe could have been included on the list, but just maybe weren't quite as harsh or big enough changes to get into the top 5. Firstly, I thought that the Deathwatch special issue ammunition change wasn't particularly helpful for them. The actual rules for the special issue ammo weren't actually too bad, to be honest. Those vengeance rounds getting a damage 2 option against the right target can be really handy. Really though, the bigger nerf is that it's only applicable to a very small amount of bolt weapons throughout the codex, mainly just being the standard bolt guns, bolt pistols and combi weapons. I'm not sure it was really necessary, to be honest. Sure, giving it to things like intercessors made Deathwatch very good damage dealers, particularly when you could combine the special issue ammunition with extra AP or extra shots, or when you could blaze away with loads of fire with storm bolters. I don't really think it would have been too strong though to keep the Deathwatch ammo the way that it was. Aside from top players just trying to make them work just for the sake of it, they certainly aren't played very widely and aren't seen as very strong by the community as a whole. For Marines, a couple of the biggest losers I'd say will be Plasma Inceptors and Scouts. Plasma Inceptors were crazily strong when the codex dropped. 50 points for all of that plasma fire was really nasty, and particularly with Marines being so prevalent in the meta, it meant that they were very easy to pick up. I think that they more or less had it right when they moved them up to 55 points, but in the latest chapter approved they went all the way up to 60, so they really are feeling like a very luxury pick, particularly for a model that has really quite a high risk of exploding itself, even with captain rerolls. Another big one from the Codex Space Marine itself was when Scouts were moved to the Elite section from the troops. They were an absolute staple of 8th edition Space Marine lists. They were rarely a wrong choice, some nice cheap bodies to put in the midfield and screen out the enemies. Losing OBSEC, not filling detachments, and also competing with the really quite cheap infiltrators and incursors just means that almost no one runs Scouts these days. Also, everything else in the Codex gaining a wound while Scouts certainly didn't help them. Perhaps a quite surprising change was the Imperial Fist Doctrine nerf. Imperial Fists already weren't really having such a great time of it in 9th edition, but Games Workshop decided to tweak their doctrine to make it weaker. Previously, all heavy weapons would get +1 damage against vehicles, but Games Workshop changed it so it's only strength 7 or more weapons, which kind of ruined the Imperial Fist's quite good synergy with heavy bolters and assault cannons as being a reasonable source of anti-tank. To be honest, maybe it is a little bit more fluffy this way, getting the bonus to the heaviest weapons, and not relying just literally on heavy bolters to gun down tanks as they kind of could before. But just seeing as they're one of the Space Marine chapters that are struggling the most, I don't really think that the change was very necessary until they get whatever next codex update they do, and they probably should have just left it as is. With 9th edition missions meaning that you can hide quite a lot of your army, their first turn Devastator doctrine often can be a bit redundant. Finally, there's all manner of units that have had slight points bumps, often really strong stuff that Games Workshop has felt the need to tone down. It's happened to the Tyranid Dimecharon, Space Marine Eradicators, the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, Drukhari Raiders and Drazar, wrote Ravagers there for some reason, not sure why, Attack Bikes, Nurglings and the Lord of Change. I'd say that all of these were very strong options within their codex. They remain perfectly playable, but now their points maybe just reflect a little bit better what they can do. There's also a couple of units like Sisters of Battle Retributors, who did drop in points a bit in the new decks, but now they can no longer move and fire their multi-melters for no penalty, which is quite a big nerf. And the Space Marine Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, that was kind of crazily undercosted for what it did, and then got quite brutally brought back in line in the Forge World Imperial Armor Compendium, making it a lot more standard issue, losing Ballistic Skill 2+ and everything. Obviously the Relic Contemptor still remains a very popular choice, though now because of its twin Volkite Culverins. So anyway, with a few honourable mentions out the way, let's get into the top 5. First up we have the nerf right at the start of 9th edition, which affected Grey Knight and Thousand Sons Smites. Previously in 8th edition, these two could spam out the Warp Charge 5 Smites, have tons of psykers in their army, and potentially bury you under a whole truckload of mortal wounds if they went really heavy on it. They could potentially be flexible, use their psychic powers for buffs and synergy, or if they faced a really elite army, just turn on the mortal wound spam and try and blow them off the board. They basically had their own special FAQ in 8th edition that allowed them to repeatedly cast Smites without the warp charge difficulty increasing like it does for most armies, but that just wasn't present in 9th edition rules. I think this change really hit the two armies very hard indeed, and in combination with poor psychic secondary rules, where the psychic secondaries aren't that easy to achieve, and the opponents could easily score secondaries for Abhor the Witch, it meant that Grey Knights and Thousand Sons certainly became some of the weaker armies in the game. Obviously, both of their codexes are somewhere on the horizon now. They're going to be coming sometime after Orcs, so they might be getting a significant boost in one way or another. It'll be interesting to see if they regain any sort of mortal wound shenanigans, but I'm sure they'll be getting powerful buffs in one way or another. Next up, we come to the Death Riders of Krieg, who out of all of the powerful units in 9th edition that got slapped with a points cost increase, these guys might have just had one of the harshest rises out of any of them. Death Riders of Krieg suddenly got very good in the new Imperial Armor Compendium, getting a weird sort of side grade which meant that their melee power actually went down a bit, but for some reason these disturbing clawed horses became one of the toughest units in the entire game. They were cheap at 15 points, had a big 3 wounds at toughness 4, a 4+ armor save, and most importantly a 5+ feel no pain to ignore wounds. It added up to some ridiculously silly numbers, where 100 points of horses would need some insane firepower to bring them down. I believe it added up to Space Marines firing something like 24 las cannons at them, 56 heavy bolter shots, or 135 bolt rifle shots. It did seem that their durability was maybe a little bit too strong, and people were fielding entire detachments of them, just literally to clog up the entire board and try and hold down the objectives. In the most recent FAQ though, Games Workshop really did take the nerf back to them with a vengeance. They got bumped up 5 points all the way up to 20 points each, which is still fairly okay for their durability, but without much attack or hitting power it makes them a little bit less crazy and people less likely to spam entire detachments of them. I do think that maybe their durability was a bit silly, but it might have been nice to make them a little bit more balanced out, maybe give them a little bit more hitting power if you are going to raise their cost by a big 33%, just to bring their durability into line. One of the next biggest nerfs I wanted to talk about was to the Dark Technomancers, perhaps one of the cheesiest things that came out of the new Drukhari Codex, but also maybe dealt with a little bit punitively, kind of removing it as an option that you'd ever really want to take. I'm sure that this is still fairly fresh in many people's memories, but Dark Technomancers is one of the custom Homunculus Coven upgrades, where every time one of their ranged units shoots, they can overcharge their weapon, have the chance of killing the model or taking some mortal wounds, but getting a seriously big damage buff for that penalty, with +1 damage to their weapons and also +1 to wound. It just made liquefy guns particularly insane, as they didn't need to roll to hit at all, so they wouldn't ever run the risk of killing themselves, and plus they were some of the best beneficiaries of those rules. If you had 2 units of 5 racks in a raider, each of them with 2 liquefy guns, you'd have a pretty crazy damage dealing Hoover unit that can just fly around the board melting enemies off the table. Each squad will put out an average of 7 strength 4 AP-2 damage 2 hits, so that will be 14 in total, so if you can wing your raider close enough, you'd melt 9 wounds off a standard toughness 7 vehicle, around 6 dead Space Marines, or 12 dead Guardsmen on average. You could just literally point these guys at anything and they'd do a fairly efficient job of removing it. The nerf that they put on it was just fixing it by basically making it not work with liquefy guns at all. To me this felt just maybe a little bit heavy-handed, as otherwise it really isn't worth that much on the vast majority of homunculus weapons, and they don't really have all that many ranged weapons to start with. I think maybe it might have been a bit better just to either tone down the damage dealing effect of it, and maybe make you roll a dice every time you use a liquefy gun and still have that chance of causing yourself mortal wounds on a 1. I do definitely think that something needed to be done about it though, so to be honest it was better that it was addressed than just left to languish and be a bit oppressive on other options on the codex or other things in the game in general. Moving on, we have Space Marine Aggressors, who were cut down from being one of the best units in the entire game in the new Space Marine Codex. Aggressors did get a very small points bump in early 9th, along with many things, but were still perhaps one of the strongest units in the entire game. A unit with the Boltstorm gauntlets and the Fragstorm grenade launchers could double shoot when stationary, and certain chapters could allow them to counter stationary even if they weren't, such as Salamanders or Ultramarines. It meant that you could get a silly 114 bolt shots from the Boltstorm ones, and now even get them into relatively easy position with strategic reserves which came in 9th. The Salamander's ones with Flamestorm gauntlets were truly murderous. There's pretty much nothing that could stand in their way from a big squad of them, as they could use the max flamer hits stratagem, and I believe that literally added up to 144 hits on a luckless enemy unit. All of this crazy damage output was basically cut in half though in the new codex, as they lost their ability to double shoot when stationary in the new codex Space Marines, and also lost their ability to advance and shoot assault weapons for no penalty. To be honest, I think the double shoot ability was always kind of problematic and hard to balance around, particularly when you had so many armies that could now make them counter stationary, so that was kind of becoming the norm rather than the exception. However, it did mean that now they're relegated to being a fairly standard mixed role unit, and they kind of struggle for significance compared with the other Space Marine elite damage dealers, things like Terminators, Blade Guard vets, Vanguard vets, or perhaps even Eradicators. The Flamestorm options still seem like a fairly decent choice in Salamanders, and in general they're certainly not a bad unit, but they're just no longer anywhere near as crazy standout as they were before. Finally, last on our list for 5 of the biggest nerfs in 9th edition, we come to the shield drones. I'm sure many people who played Tau in 8th edition won't have particularly fond memories of these little critters. They were really cheap at 10 points and essentially functioned like extra wounds for riptides, broadsides, or other Tau battlesuits. It could kind of make the biggest guns in the Tau army completely untargetable, unless you managed to get something across the board very quickly to destroy the drones, or you had just ridiculous crazy amounts of firepower to sacrifice to eventually chew through them. I feel though that the way that Tau were balanced in 8th edition was largely around shield drones providing this effect. It meant that quite a lot of their units were fairly high priced, as you could afford to pay a bit more for the big guns if you knew that they were almost guaranteed to be safe. At the start of 9th, their points were bumped from 10 points to 15 points, which made them far more of a luxury buy, and not just something that you want to spam absolutely as many of as you possibly could into an army. I feel like that maybe felt about right, but for some reason in January, Games Workshop decided to increase the price of standard tactical drones all the way up to 20 points, meaning that unless you take any drones in attached squads, you'd be paying for them absolutely through the nose. It means that no one can really afford to take them in that role anymore, so they're far more niche, and I think it's one of the many reasons why Tau just really aren't having a good time of it in 9th. One of their previous most powerful mechanics is so much less efficient than it was before. So let me know what you think. Were any of these nerfs too punitive, or are you happy to see these very strong units being quite rare presences on the table these days? And as I said, if you can think of any other big nerfs that Games Workshop has put out in 9th, please let me know down in the video comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming, with new stuff coming out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which is one way that you can help keep them coming if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry to the big prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help keep the videos coming, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.